can see this just in front of us here. We've got this very old-looking wall, looking exactly like the old hut circles and enclosure walls that we see on the moor. It's covered in vegetation, and you can see it wiggling slightly and straggling away across in front of us. And you can just pick it up on the hill on the other side. And many of these reefs do go for a good long way.
And are they part of a system, or do they just sort of radiate out haphazardly?
Well, you get isolated ones that, as far as I can see, are probably demarcating areas of pasture land. But you also get what we call the parallel reef systems, which are really very much the Highland Zone equivalent of the sort of thing that's been known for a very long time in Wessex. And these are usually very carefully planned layouts. The fields are usually laid out on pretty well the same axis. And indeed, the one we're standing in now, I expect you can see across the dark gorge, this very impressive gorge that's just in front of us.
Yeah.
Well, you can probably pick up the fields in the distance over on the other side of the gorge. And if, in fact, you and I started walking now, we'd have to walk for about 4 miles before we got to the other end of the system.
The scale of these things is really quite staggering, isn't it?
It is, particularly in this one. And also the way in which they weren't bothered about going across major physical obstacles like the dark gorge.
So it's landscape architecture on the grand scale.
Oh, very much so. And in fact, in the early, immature days of our study, we actually used to talk about obsessional land surveying, which I think is carrying it a bit far, but you can see what I mean.
Do you think they actually had instruments to lay out these systems?
Now, we haven't really got as far as studying that in detail yet. We can certainly see that they had some marking out points. For instance, sometimes they were obviously aiming for a barrow, and there are other cases where we find a reeve running up to a small standing stone and then changing its course actually where that standing stone is, so that perhaps there were early markers, if you like, which were worked up to by different gangs of people.
And of course, one of the beauties of this is, now that you've made us aware of all this evidence over the moors, is that really anybody can come and just see it if you've just got eyes to see.
Yes, that's right. It's a complete landscape laid out in front of us. Although, having said that, Peter, the obvious game that prehistorians might like to play with Dartmoor, and have probably always been tempted by it, is simply to look at these very visible hut circles and do some sort of account in order to try and work out population figures. But I have to point out to you that this site we're standing on at the moment, you can see this beautiful big stone hut circle in front of us. No problem about that. It's a completely standard Dartmoor antiquity. But somewhat to our surprise, or perhaps we shouldn't have been surprised, when we were digging there last summer, we found that there was a circular timber hut standing beside it, with its entrance facing the same way, and obviously part of the same setup. So it may be that every stone-founded hut circle that we walk past on the moor, we have to envisage perhaps a number of outbuildings, or perhaps not outbuildings, perhaps just separate buildings,
or earlier
built
buildings.
in wood, or indeed earlier buildings, yes, of course.
Yeah. This has introduced a rather new element, hasn't it, into Dartmoor archaeology, which has been dominated very much by the granite. If you're actually getting timber buildings, this is a bit worrying.
Yes, it is.
It's very tempting to ask who were these people and who was organising them, making these very straight lines to very precise points in the landscape.
I think you will find that in many cases in the British landscape, the periods when people are most concerned with accurate land survey and with dividing it up into little parcels, these are usually the times when you've got an obsessionally egalitarian society, a society where people are struggling for land, as for instance perhaps in the 19th century Irish situation, or, well, let's take the English medieval situation where you've got this really elaborate system of land division, which I think any Martian observing from a spaceship would be, quite frankly, he would be astonished at it. And yet this presumably comes from an almost obsessionally egalitarian society. And although, as you and I know, it's very difficult to say very much about prehistoric society, the provisional idea I've got at the moment is that this was perhaps a society that was very concerned with fair shares for different groups. And of course, as you can see in front of us, putting long straight lines across varying slopes and varying kinds of country might be one way of ensuring or providing a framework by which, on the whole, individuals and groups could get a roughly fair share of the land.
Yes.
I think that the most important thing in this particular bit of country is the land right behind us, because something like 50 yards behind where we're standing, there's what I call the terminal reeve. It's the reeve up to which all the reeves run, and just beyond that are the indications of what determined where this reeve was to be, because only about 10 yards beyond that terminal reeve there's a very nice stone row running along the same axis as the terminal. And then beyond that there are various barrow cemeteries. In fact, there's one big barrow which seems to frown over the field system here, almost as though the old boy who was buried in it owned the land, and there's somehow dominating it even after his death.
Ian, you've kept very quiet while we've been discussing, perhaps speculating is a better word, about this evidence on Dartmoor. How does it strike you as a landscape historian?
Well, I think the thing that strikes me most of all is that every piece of land we're looking at, from tip to toe on Dartmoor, as it were, is a man-made landscape. The blanket bogs of the high plateau, right through down to these pastures which were so intensively occupied in the prehistoric period, all are man-made landscapes, a response by man to the use of the landscape for resources at a particular time. It's not a natural landscape at all.
Well, what I'm going to do now is suggest that I take both of you back inland, as it were, and up into central southern England, and let's have a look at the landscape from the farming point of view of the Chalk Downlands.
I think what I notice, first of all, having not been here before, is the immense amount of this landscape we're looking at, which is taken up with things of archaeological interest. Looking around us, we can see long barrows, we can see round barrows on the skyline, and all around us, down here to my left and away round behind us as well, is this tremendous set of field systems, which even at this time of the year, when the vegetation is quite high, are really quite visible and indeed believable, even to someone like myself. Peter, you want to tell us perhaps a little bit more about these?
What is difficult, of course, is to envisage what it was like in 2000 BC, let alone 5000 BC. But the general evidence from this part of the North Wiltshire Downs, the northern part of Salisbury Plain, is that by about 2000 BC, the landscape, to a very large extent, probably had come to look pretty much like what it does now. In other words, such forest as there had been had already been cleared by the early farmers.
You've been, I think, doing some digging up here. Do you think that the edges of fields in those days would have been as bare as they are today, or do you envisage hedges and ditches and that sort of thing?
Up here, the earliest regular field system we have is dated somewhere in the second millennium BC, and they are earlier than most of the field systems that we can see all around us here, which date to the period after about 500 BC. And now we know most about the fields themselves and their edges from this later period, the later prehistoric period. Generally speaking, a lot of care has gone into making the edges of the fields. Here we have evidence of fences, we have evidence of ditches, and there's some very nice examples of dry stone wall of the sort that you have on Dartmoor and other parts of the Highland zone. Do you see over there, for example, behind us, you see running up that hillside, there's that long, well, it looks like a streak through the grass.
Yeah.
Well, that's a ditch, which we sectioned in various places. We know it's about 4 feet deep, belonging to the second millennium BC. And the significant thing in terms of the landscape, and it's not very much to look at, is that on the south side of it, you have acres and acres of prehistoric fields, over there laid out with dry stone walls and lines of stones which have been cleared off the area to be cultivated. And on the north side of it, on the other side of it, there is absolutely nothing. And I think that's a classic example of where a blank area in the landscape is actually very significant in understanding how the landscape has evolved. Nothing has ever been built or done there except presumably sheep and cattle graze. But that's a very interesting point when you're coming to trying to understand how the landscape was being used in about 1500 BC.
What sort of implications for society has all this got if you've got these vast field systems being laid out across these North Wiltshire Downs?
I think the first implication is that there must have been far more people around than we're accustomed to think of, because looking at this landscape here, we're looking at a landscape which has not only been used a lot during time, over a very long period of time, but has been used intensively, I think, at any one period in the past, certainly from 2000 BC onwards. As to how people organise themselves, I really don't know, though the more I look at the evidence here, and I don't think the evidence here is exceptional, except in its good preservation. I think that's a very important point. The more I look at the evidence here, the more I'm inclined to see, on the one hand, an oligarchy of some sort. I mean, there's some central social organisation which is supervising this exploitation of the landscape. And because of the communal implications of that, I'm coming round to the view of seeing these things that we used to call Celtic fields as perhaps being part of a great communal field system, almost like the medieval open field system, rather than them being the plots of individual free peasants, as it were, each doing their own thing.
Certainly on Dartmoor, I've been thinking more and more in these sort of terms, because it seems to me that one possible explanation for this long axial arrangement is that possibly people were trying to get fair shares of relatively good and relatively bad land, and one of the obvious ways of doing this might be to arrange the land in this sort of way.
Now, it brought me to what's going to be the last stop of our little tour around. This is right on the northern edge of the Wessex Downs, Barbary Castle, which again is a site that anybody can go to. It's a country park now. And from Barbary Castle, the Chalk Downs are just behind us. Dartmoor in the southwest is a long way to our left, and we're looking out over the Midland Plain, the Upper Thames Valley, and lands further north. The first thing that strikes me, of course, is that you see a lot more trees. Now, are we looking there at the remains of a picture of the landscape which was all trees in 5000 BC, Ian?
I think that's very likely. There must have been an immense amount of forest, the sort of forest where perhaps a squirrel could have taken off from here and swung all the way through trees, avoiding certain clearings on the way, of course, all the way through the trees somewhere up to central Scotland and maybe beyond. But the question I want to ask you people here, though, is that we've been talking all about hills. They're right all the way back behind us, and we've been thinking very largely in terms of hills. Now, the things we've been saying of hills, particularly with regards to field systems and agricultural layouts, can you say the same sorts of things about the landscapes in front of us? Can you say it about the clay lowlands and the great river valleys of the middle of this country?
Well, of course, we're confronted with difficulties in the Midlands, because on the whole they've been, it's only relatively recently that the chalklands have been heavily destroyed, whereas the Midlands have been people's favourite farming lands for a long time. But I think, yes, we are beginning to see in one or two favoured locations that there probably was a good deal of the open landscape in various areas of the Midlands. For instance, on the edges of the fens, just outside Peterborough, Francis Pryor has been digging there for some years now, and he's been showing that there's really quite a complicated system of ditches leading in towards the edge of the fens. Now, when he saw these on the air photograph, most people would have assumed that these were Roman. However, it turned out that they were second millennium in date.
Roman because they were so regular,
Yes,
if
that's
I remember
right.
rightly.
That's right.
They were straight lines, so people assume they're Romans. But this is where it all seems to link up into one pattern now. The straight lines on Dartmoor, the ditches I've been talking about on the Wiltshire Downs, and the same pattern down in the valleys. The difference is, as Andrew said, is that in a way we've been reflecting the fact that archaeological evidence in the form of earthworks and stone structures has survived in the marginal areas, and the equivalent evidence, which we previously assumed did not exist in the Midlands and in the river valleys, is now coming to light largely through air photographs. And generally speaking, my impression, Andrew, is that the overall picture is pretty much the same all over the country. Man the farmer has had a very considerable impact all over the place, and not just on the downs.
Yes, in fact, in 20 or 30 years, it may be that we're going to have to be asking the question, where didn't man have any impact? Were there any natural areas at all in the central part of England by about 1000 BC?
And a subsidiary question, and this will make you think, Ian, is why was he farming on the hills at all?
I think it could only be because he needed the land, and there were so many of him that he had to take up the whole part of the living space that was available, then as now, perhaps.
So, as a result of the way in which new, long-term projects, not just little excavations, are now being organised in the systematic study of the British landscape, backed up by the scientific analysis of the ancient environmental evidence like pollen, grain and bones, the detailed examination of large areas of the landscape rather than the excavation of a single site in isolation, this in cooperation with geographers, botanists, soil scientists, ecologists. From all this, we're beginning to see how our British landscape has been continually used and how it has evolved into the countryside that we see about us today. Of course, the picture is by no means clear yet, and it will be some time before we can say what our earliest farmers were doing with as much confidence as we give to, say, life in medieval England. But in recent years, we have made considerable progress in our understanding of how life was lived as farming became a way of life. And I'm pretty sure we'll soon be able to answer many of the new questions we're now asking about the 4,000 years of farming in Britain before the Celts.